The hospital air has a unique scent. It's a sterile, sharp mix of antiseptic, latex, and the faint metallic tang of blood, all underscored by the low hum of life support machines. For 36 hours, this symphony of survival had been my entire world. I was Dr. Eris Thorne, a third-year surgical resident, and my feet were staging a rebellion against my shoes. Every step was a negotiation. I leaned against the cool wall of the corridor, my eyes tracing the slow, rhythmic drip of a saline bag in a nearby room. It was the only calm thing in a world of controlled chaos. My last surgery had been a complex appendectomy, a ticking clock that we'd managed to disarm just in time. The adrenaline had long since evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a familiar, insistent vibration. I sighed, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I typed and deleted 3 different replies. Almost, I finally sent. A simple lie that felt easier than explaining the mountain of paperwork that still stood between me and the door. His reply was instantaneous. Mom is here. She's been waiting. Of course. Eleanor. My mother-in-law's visits were always an event. They were scheduled with military precision and usually coincided with a moment when my life was at its most hectic, as if designed to highlight the stark contrast between her immaculate, orderly world and my own beautiful mess. I finished my charts in a haze, my mind already halfway home. I pictured our apartment, the one David had so meticulously decorated. He was an architect, a man who saw the world in clean lines and perfect angles. I, on the other hand, lived in a world of messy, unpredictable biology. Our lives were a constant collision of his order and my chaos. I loved him. I truly did. But lately, it felt like we were speaking different languages. His language was about form and structure. Mine was about function and survival. The drive home was a blur. I remember the streetlights smearing across the windshield like wet paint. When I finally turned the key in our lock, the exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. The apartment was pristine, as always, not a cushion out of place. The scent of lemon polish hung in the air, a sure sign Eleanor had been on a tidying spree. David and Eleanor were sitting at the dining table, a perfect still-life portrait of impatience. Eleanor, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and expensive cashmere sweater, gave me a tight-lipped smile. David didn't look up from his laptop. "You're late," he said, his voice flat. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact, which somehow made it worse. "I'm sorry," I managed, dropping my bag by the door. "We had an emergency, a perforated appendix that took longer than expected." "There's always an emergency," he said, finally closing the laptop. His eyes, the same cool gray as a storm cloud, met mine. "Mom and I have been waiting for dinner." My heart sank. Dinner. In my 36-hour adrenaline-fueled haze, I had completely forgotten it was my turn to cook. We had a system, a carefully constructed schedule designed to bring order to our chaotic lives. Tuesday was my day. "David, I am so sorry. It completely slipped my mind. I'm exhausted. Can we please just order something?" Eleanor made a small, delicate scoffing sound. In my day, a wife always made sure her husband had a hot meal on the table, no matter how tired she was. It's about respect, dear. I felt a familiar flush of anger and shame. I bit my tongue, forcing a polite smile. "Things are a bit different now, Eleanor. My job is demanding." "So is David's," she countered smoothly, "but he still finds time to manage this household." I looked at David, pleading with my eyes for him to intervene, to defend me. He just stared back, his expression unreadable. He stood up, walked over to the kitchen counter and leaned against it, crossing his arms. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, being judged and found wanting. "I need to talk to you, Eris," David said, his voice dangerously quiet. He gestured for me to follow him into the kitchen, away from his mother's prying ears. I followed, my stomach twisting into a knot of dread. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. His anger was a cold, quiet thing. He waited until I was standing in front of him, trapped between the refrigerator and the stove. "This isn't working," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Your job, your hours, the constant emergencies, I feel like I am the last thing on your list of priorities." "That's not true, David," I whispered back, my voice trembling. "You know how important my residency is. It's not forever." "Isn't it?" he asked, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "It's always one more year, one more rotation, one more emergency. I need a partner, Eris, not a ghost who occasionally appears in our bed too tired to even talk." He took a deep breath, and his next words were the ones that shattered everything. "I need a wife, so you have a choice. You can either be a doctor, or you can be my wife. Go in there, cook a proper meal, and show me that this marriage matters to you. Cook, Eris, or we're done." The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering like shards of glass. Cook, or we're done. It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum, a line drawn in the pristine sand of our perfectly curated life. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My entire world, all the chaos and exhaustion of the hospital, faded into a dull roar in my ears. All I could hear was his voice, calm and cruel, reducing my entire being, my passion, my years of study, my grueling, life-saving work, to a single domestic task. My mind raced, trying to find a response, a defense. But there was none. This wasn't a debate about dinner. It was about control. It was about him wanting to put me back into a box that I had outgrown long ago. "You can't be serious," I finally stammered, my voice a choked whisper. "You're giving me an ultimatum? Over a meal?" "It's not about the meal, Eris, and you know it," he said, his gray eyes cold and unyielding. "It's about what it represents. It's about priority. It's about us. I need to know if you're still in this." From the dining room, I could hear the faint clink of Eleanor's teacup against its saucer, a delicate sound that felt like a gunshot in the tense silence. She was listening. Of course she was. This wasn't just his ultimatum, it was a joint statement. I felt cornered, my back literally against the cold steel of the refrigerator. I looked at his face, searching for the man I had married, the one who used to trace the lines on my tired face and tell me he was proud of me. But that man was gone, replaced by this cold, hard stranger. My pager chose that exact moment to scream, a shrill, piercing cry that cut through the tension. I flinched, my hand instinctively going to my hip. A code blue. Emergency room. I didn't even have to look at the number. It was a summons from my other world, the one where I wasn't a failing wife, but a competent doctor. "I have to go," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of its usual authority. David actually laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Of course you do. The hospital calls and you run. Go on, Eris, run. But don't be surprised by what's not here when you get back." I didn't say another word. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and walked out the door, the sound of it clicking shut behind me feeling terrifyingly final. The tears I'd been holding back started to fall as I ran to my car, hot and angry. I wasn't just crying for my marriage, I was crying for myself, for the woman who was being asked to choose between two halves of her own soul. Back at the hospital, the chaos was a welcome embrace. It was a language I understood. The ER was a whirlwind of motion and sound. "What do we have?" I shouted to the charge nurse as I pulled on a pair of gloves. Jane Gable, 68-year-old female, collapsed at home. The nurse, a formidable woman named Brenda, rattled off. "BP is 80/50 and dropping. Husband says she's been exhausted for weeks, not eating, not sleeping." I pushed through the curtain into the trauma bay. Mrs. Gable was pale, her skin clammy. Her husband, a frantic, worried man in a rumpled sweater, was clutching her hand. "She does everything for me, doctor," he said, his voice thick with panic. "I had a stroke last year. She's my caregiver. She cooks, she cleans, she manages my medication. She never rests." I told her to slow down, but she wouldn't listen. My blood ran cold. It was like looking into a distorted mirror, a woman who had erased herself for the sake of her husband. As we worked to stabilize her, her husband's words echoed in my head. "She does everything for me." He wasn't saying it with malice, but with a kind of helpless love. Yet the result was the same. Mrs. Gable was on this gurney because she had given every piece of herself away. Her body had finally just quit. We discovered she had a severe gastrointestinal bleed, likely from a stress-induced ulcer. She needed an emergency endoscopy and a blood transfusion. As I was explaining the procedure to her husband, my mentor, Dr. Marcus Vance, the head of surgery, walked in. He was a man of few words, but his presence was always calming. He looked at the patient, then at me. He had a way of seeing everything, not just the medical charts, but the stories behind them. "Thorne," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you look like you've been through a war." "Something like that," I mumbled, focusing on the consent form. "You're a good doctor, Eris," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on me. "You have a gift. You see the whole patient, not just the disease. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like that's not enough." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow. He had no idea what was happening in my personal life, but somehow, he knew exactly what I needed to hear. It was a lifeline in the middle of my own personal storm. It was a reminder of who I was outside of my apartment, outside of my fractured marriage. Here, I was not a disappointment. Here, I was valued. Here, I was necessary. The endoscopy was tricky. Mrs. Gable's system was weak. I worked with a quiet, intense focus, the rest of the world falling away. This was my sanctuary. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, the focused beam of the endoscope, the precise movements of my hands. This was my order, my structure. We found the bleed and successfully cauterized it. She was going to be okay. As I was scrubbing out, feeling the first real sense of relief I'd had all day, Brenda poked her head into the room. "Dr. Thorne, your husband is here. He's at the nurse's station. He seems agitated." My heart hammered against my ribs. "David, here." I thought about his last words, his threat. Had he come to make a scene? To humiliate me in the one place where I felt competent and in control? I dried my hands, my movements slow and deliberate, trying to shore up my defenses. I walked out of the scrub room and down the corridor. And there he was. He was standing by the main desk, his face a mask of thunder. And next to him, looking completely out of place in her cashmere and pearls, was Eleanor. My personal crisis had officially followed me to work. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was an invasion. And I had a terrible feeling that the real emergency was only just beginning. David saw me first. His eyes locked onto mine, and he started walking towards me, his long strides eating up the distance in the busy hospital corridor. People, nurses, orderlies, other doctors, parted for him like he was a force of nature. Eleanor trailed a few steps behind, her face a carefully blank mask, but her eyes were darting everywhere, taking in the controlled chaos of the ER. "We need to finish our conversation, Eris," David said, his voice low and tight, clearly intended only for me, but it carried an intensity that made a nearby nurse glance over with curiosity. "This is not the time or the place, David," I said, my own voice a strained whisper. I was acutely aware of my colleagues. Dr. Vance was just down the hall, reviewing a chart. Brenda was at the main desk, pretending not to watch. My professional world and my personal nightmare were colliding in real time. "I think it's the perfect place," he countered, stepping closer, forcing me back a step. "This is the place you always choose over me. Over us. I want you to look at all this. This chaos, this sickness, and tell me it's more important than your husband, than your home." My pager went off again. A series of short, frantic beeps. I glanced down. It was Mrs. Gable's room. Code red. She was crashing. "I have to go," I said, my voice sharp with urgency, trying to move past him. He physically blocked my path. "No," he said, his voice rising in volume. "You don't. You are going to listen to me. For once, I am going to be the emergency. I meant what I said. Cook dinner, be my wife, or we are done. What is your answer?" His voice echoed in the hallway. A few heads turned. I saw Dr. Vance look up from his chart, his brow furrowed in concern. I felt a hot, mortifying blush creep up my neck. He had done it. He had brought his war to my doorstep and was trying to burn my world down. It was in that moment of absolute humiliation that something inside me snapped. The fear, the exhaustion, the shame, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, hard clarity. I looked him straight in the eye. "My answer," I said, my voice shaking but clear, "is that a woman in my care is dying. Get out of my way." Before he could react, Eleanor's voice cut through the air, sharp as a scalpel. "David, let her pass." He turned, shocked that his mother would do anything but support him. "Mom, stay out of this." "I will not," she said, her voice trembling with an emotion I couldn't identify. "This is a hospital. Let the doctor do her job." Just as I pushed past him, a nurse came running down the hall. "Dr. Thorne, it's Mrs. Gable. She's throwing VTAC. She's not responsive." The world narrowed to a single point. I ran. The short distance to Mrs. Gable's room felt like miles. I burst through the door. The monitor was screaming, a chaotic, jagged line where a steady rhythm should have been. She was in ventricular tachycardia, a lethal arrhythmia. "Get the crash cart," I yelled. "Charge to 200, now!" I started CPR, the force of the compressions jarring my already exhausted body. My mind was a steel trap of protocols and procedures. This was what I was trained for. This was who I was. In the chaos, I was vaguely aware of two figures standing in the doorway, David and Eleanor. They were watching, silent and stunned, as I fought to save a stranger's life. "Clear!" I yelled, pressing the paddles to her chest. Her body jerked. Nothing. Again. "Charge to 300. The scene was a blur of frantic activity, the smell of ozone filling the air. I was no longer Eris Thorne, the wife. I was Dr. Thorne, the surgeon, and I was not going to let this woman die. "Clear!" I shouted again, the paddles discharging their life-giving electricity into Mrs. Gable's chest. Her body arched off the bed. For a heart-stopping second, the chaotic rhythm on the monitor persisted. Then a single, beautiful beep. And another. And another. A steady sinus rhythm bloomed across the screen. We had her back. A collective sigh of relief filled the small room. I stood there for a moment, my chest heaving, my hands still tingling from the defibrillator. The immediate crisis was over. The adrenaline began to recede, and the crushing weight of the last hour, the last day, came rushing back in. I stepped out of the room, peeling off my gloves, my hands shaking. Dr. Vance was there, and he placed a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Good work, Thorne. Textbook." He gave me a knowing look, his eyes glancing towards the end of the hall where David and Eleanor stood, looking like statues carved from ice. "Go handle your other emergency," he said quietly, and then he was gone, giving me the space I needed. I took a deep breath and walked towards them. The hallway suddenly felt a mile long. David looked pale, his earlier anger replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Eleanor, however, looked different. The hard, critical mask she always wore had crumbled. Her eyes were wide and they were glistening with unshed tears. I stopped a few feet in front of them, too tired for anger, too numb for tears. I just waited. The silence was absolute. It was Eleanor who broke it. She took a hesitant step forward, not looking at me, but directly at her son. Her voice when she spoke was quiet but carried a strength I had never heard before. "I have spent my entire life," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "in the kitchen. I was raised to believe that the most important thing a woman could do was to keep a perfect house and put a hot meal on the table for her husband. My husband, your father, was a good man, but he believed that was my place. I had dreams, you know. I wanted to be a botanist. I was good at it. I had a scholarship, but I gave it up, because that's what women did." She finally turned her gaze to me, and in her eyes I saw not judgment, but a profound, aching regret. "I watched you in that room, Eris. You weren't just doing a job. You were commanding an army. You held a life in your hands and you did not falter. What you do, it's a miracle. It's a gift. And I have been so wrong. I was jealous. I was bitter because you were living a life I was never allowed to even dream of." She turned back to David, and her voice hardened, the newfound steel lashing out at him. "And you," she said, her voice dripping with a disappointment that was more cutting than any anger. "You are your father's son in all the wrong ways. He at least lived in a time when he didn't know any better. You have no such excuse. You have this brilliant, powerful, life-saving woman by your side, and you tried to reduce her to a cook? You stood in her way while she was trying to save a life and gave her an ultimatum about dinner? I have never been more ashamed in my entire life, David. You didn't just disrespect your wife. You disrespected everything I sacrificed so that you could be a better man than your father. And you failed." David just stood there, speechless. He looked as if his own mother had struck him. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing to say. She had dismantled his entire argument, his entire worldview, with a few devastatingly honest sentences. Eleanor walked right up to me, her composure finally breaking. A single tear traced a path down her carefully powdered cheek. She reached out and took my hands in hers. They were surprisingly warm. "I am so sorry, my dear," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For every critical word. For every judgmental glance. You are not a disappointment. You are an inspiration. Please forgive an old woman her bitterness." I could only nod, my own throat tight with unshed tears. In this sterile, unforgiving hospital corridor, I had lost my husband, but impossibly, I had found an ally in the one person I least expected. David turned and walked away without another word, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He didn't look back. Eleanor and I just stood there, two women from different generations, bound by a sudden, painful, and beautiful understanding. The patient in the room behind me was stable, her physical heart beating steadily. But it was my own heart, the one that had been bruised and battered, that was finally, slowly, beginning to heal. A week later, I sat across from David in a coffee shop, a neutral territory we had agreed upon. The air between us was thick with unspoken words. He looked tired. The arrogance he had worn like armor at the hospital was gone, replaced by a raw, uncertain vulnerability. He had been calling, texting, leaving long, rambling voicemails. This was the first time I had agreed to see him. "I was wrong, Eris," he began, his voice hoarse. "What I did, what I said, it was unforgivable. My mother, she said things I'd never heard before. About her life. About what she gave up. I never knew. She never felt she could tell you," I said softly, stirring my untouched latte. "Just like I never felt I could make you understand what my work means to me. I thought if I just worked harder, if I just tried to be everything, the perfect doctor and the perfect wife, that it would be enough." "It was more than enough," he said, reaching across the table for my hand. I let him take it, but my fingers remained limp in his grasp. "You are more than enough. I was the one who wasn't enough. I was insecure. I saw how much you loved your job, how important you were at the hospital, and I felt small, left behind. I wanted to pull you back into a world where I was the center of your universe. It was selfish, and it was cruel." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt a deep, profound sadness. "I know you were," I said, "and I forgive you for feeling that way. But I don't know if I can forget what you asked me to sacrifice. You asked me to choose between being a doctor and being your wife. You didn't see that I am a doctor and your wife. One doesn't cancel the other out. That is who I am. And if you can't love all of me, David, then you can't love any of me." Tears welled in his eyes. "I can," he whispered. "I want to. We can go to counseling. I'll do whatever it takes. Please, Eris, don't let this be the end." I gently pulled my hand from his. The decision had been forming in my mind all week, solidifying with every conversation I had with Eleanor, and with every moment of peace I felt when I walked the halls of the hospital without dreading what awaited me at home. "The marriage we had is over, David," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "That version of us, where I shrink myself to make you feel bigger, is done. If we are going to have a future, it has to be a new one. One built on mutual respect, not on demands. One where you are proud of me, not threatened by me. We can try counseling, but I need you to understand. I will never ever stop being a doctor. That is not negotiable." He nodded, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down his cheek. "Okay," he said. "I understand. It's more than I deserve." I left the coffee shop feeling lighter than I had in years. The future was uncertain, a blank page. But for the first time, I felt like I was the one holding the pen. Later that evening, I met Eleanor for dinner. We went to a small Italian restaurant and we talked for hours. We talked about her love for botany, and I told her about the intricate beauty of the human heart. We weren't just a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law anymore. We were two women sharing our stories, our strengths, our scars. She had saved me, in her own way, just as surely as I had saved Mrs. Gable. As I walked home that night, under a sky full of stars, I realized the most important diagnosis I had made all week was my own. The cure wasn't to give up a piece of myself. The cure was to finally, unapologetically become whole. What did you think of Eris's decision? Have you ever felt like you had to choose between your passion and a relationship? Let us know your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more medical dramas every week. Your support means the world to us.